Now let us discuss how exception handling can be done. We'll see many ways to handle exceptions. One of the way we will try to see is using error filter. So let's add one new project, MVC4 project. Let's name this project as test exception handling empty project with ASPX engine. And then as usual, we will add a controller which will have same name home and then usual method called index, a startup method. And we'll also create a view for index which will simply have a data return, that is welcome to index page. Try running this page first. I guess by mistake I picked up CSHTML as a view, so maybe I'll try to revert the code now, and from the view I'll remove index CSHTML. I'll add one view which is ASPX, and here we'll refer h1. Let's name it as this is index page. Run it now and we have slash home index. We have this as index page. Now let's close this and we need to handle certain errors now. So let's have a look at a default way of handling an error. We need to go with something called as a filter, which is called as error filter. Normally filters come in sequence. There's always authorize filter first, then under execution maybe action filter, then result, and then anywhere maybe error filter may occur. So take a situation that we have some error in the code. So we have, let's say suppose int id to be called, and maybe instead of int id we'll just try to throw the exception directly from here itself. So I would throw the exception from here, throw new exception, and then or throw new arithmetic exception. I'll specify. And in the exception we will try to put some content. Let's say this is temporary exception. Now what happens is, if at all one has to handle the exception, we have an option here, that is you may create a view specifically for the exception itself. So if we take an example, I'll add one. Now normally exceptions may occur. We may want to go to some error view, just like we normally set up in web forms, maybe some custom error specific web page also, some .html pages. Same way, we want to handle error, but then that error handling should not be with respect to a controller. That error handling, or at least showing an error, should not be with respect to a controller. Should be common all over the application. So what we do normally is, instead of creating views for errors or common views inside a controller folder, let's create a different folder, and that folder we call it as shared. Shared is a very standard folder under views folder. So if at all any view that the MVC engine is trying to find, if at all that view is not found in respective controller folder, it is always searched into a shared folder. So now inside shared, I'm going to add one view. Let's call this as maybe let's say arithmetic or error view 01. And inside this error view 01, I'll just try to enter. This is for arithmetic exception. Now, so whenever arithmetic exception occurs, I want to go to that arithmetic exception view. But then how do I tell my application if this exception occurs, then go to so and so view? So we have a very nice attribute here, which is ultimately going to act as a filter. So anywhere in sequence, if any error occurs, then if it's arithmetic exception, I want to navigate to error view 01.aspx. So we'll specify an attribute here called as handle error, and inside the handle error we'll specify the exception type and the view's name. So we may specify exception type is equal to the type of the exception that we are planning to handle is arithmetic exception, And the view that we are planning to go to is error view 01. Yeah. Now, if you try running the program now, let's run the program. Then we have, let's say, exception thrown here, code breaks. Let's continue. And then instead of it navigating to my view, which I suggested, it shows me the default error stack in front of me. Why it doesn't go automatically to the error view page itself? As I have already specified, handle error on so and so exception, go to so and so view. So to do that, we'll have to enable custom error handling for this application. Just like in case of ASP.NET Web Forms, custom error handling is by default remote only. So similar way, we have it here as remote only. So which means exceptions will be in a handled manner will be shown to the client's machine, not to this machine which is server's machine. But I want exception handling to be tested. I want to see the exception getting handled in my application. And for that, I'm going to set now custom errors mode equal to on, just like we normally specify in case of web forms. So I'll go to Web.Config file, and inside the Web.Config file, I'll specify custom errors as a tag. No IntelliSense, so I'll type it custom errors mode equal to, and that will be on. Let's try running this now. Small mistake. Let's run. And then F5 again, F5, and you will find out this is for arithmetic exception occurs on the screen right now. So that way it becomes very easy to deal with exceptions in case of MVC. But what if different other exception comes up then? You also have a way, if you don't wish to handle the exceptions in this way, you may add this exception multiple number of times, and you may specify different exception types one after another. And then you may specify, like after all, maybe a common exception handling way, that is type of exception as well. So if at all I run the program and you say F5, this will also go to, you can say that this is for arithmetic exception page, which was ultimately error view 1. So for exception, I said go to error view 1. So you may specify different views for different exceptions, and automatic redirection will happen to that view itself. Now, since it's a view, we can always have a way back. We can always go, and since we are still in MVC, because we are going to show a view to the user, we can always take user back to respective page. We can always ask user to go to some launcher page, and which means we are still inside the system of MVC, which means we have not gone out of MVC. So this is one way of handling it. Second option that we have here, what if you suppose if you want to let's say add up this exception into a database. Like I did not, one way is like you can obviously you can go for handling try catch block. You can write down your code, you can put try catch block, and during the exception you may try to say return and redirect to specific view which is called as, maybe let's say error view or so, and you may write down error method which will return to error view or so. This is one way, but this is everywhere you will have to do this approach. What we want to do now is we want to get this thing done at a common location, and the common location that we found is handle error right now. But then what if there's a customization required? Before I show you that view, I want to log the error into a database also. Then let's try to see what handle error is all about. So let's say right click and go to definition of handle error. Inside handle error, you will find out a method exists called as OnException. It's a virtual method, which means we'll be able to override it if we want. And OnException, you get something called as filter context, which is exception context itself, which means we'll be able to grab every detail that we want, and we can write any custom code for pushing data into a database as well. So I'm going to close this now, and maybe here itself I'll write a class, not a proper location, but then for the sake of testing, I'll write down here my handle error class, and which will internally inherit from handle error as handle error attribute class. And then we will be able to override that method which is called as OnException here. So if I put a breakpoint now, and instead of putting handle error here, if I write down my handle error now, that should be it. My handle error, it should be my handle error over here. Let's see what happens now. Run the code. We break in the code. We'll say continue, and you end up into this function which is called as OnException. And under the filter context exception, you'll find out you have all the details like exception has occurred of so and so type. Maybe let's say some you can get any detail, like maybe let's say if you want to get view data, if you want to get view bag, everything you can collect here, and you can push it into database or take any action that you require against that MVC specific data. And here, after entering data, anyway you are going to redirect user to the page called as, maybe let's say, your own error page, which is mentioned here, just like we mentioned earlier in handle error. But then suppose there are 100 methods like index we have got. Are we going to go and specify this my handle error or handle error on all 100 methods? Absolutely no, because that's going to be sticky to the you can say a function or code. Then everywhere, if I make a change into the class name called as my handle error as your handle error, I may have to do the change everywhere. So better option. If you see the implementation of handle error, let's go to definition of handle error. In the definition, if you expand this attribute class, this will show you the usage of the attribute is at method level and is also at class level. So how about not adding this exception handling functionality to the function or method? How about adding this to the class itself? That way, what happens now? Any error occurs in any of the method that we have, we can very well handle it using this attribute. Let's try running it now and see what happens. Run now. So exception occurs. This goes to my handle error again, and then we'll say F5, and again we'll end up in that specific exception that we wanted. So this becomes a very nice way that at one single location you specify my handle error at a class level, and you may have every method free from handling exceptions that way. But then is this way, again there's one drawback. What if at all we have got hundreds of controllers in case of MVC application, and what if those hundreds of controllers need to handle exceptions in a similar manner? Then we have one more option. How about maybe specifying this handle error into one base controller class? So base class controller will define, let's call this as base controller, and inherit from a class called as controller. And on this base controller, let's specify this exception, handle error. And then here onwards, your controller will never inherit from the normal controller. Your controller will inherit from base controller now onwards. So if you understand this, if I take this down a bit, easy to understand code now. So we have got my handle error attached at a class level, base level. Base is implemented or inherited into home controller, and then we have got, let's say, other function available. Now let me run the code and see whether it even still works. Run the code again. We'll break into the code, and again I'll say F5. It comes to exception, and then it will continue happily to our error view. So this also becomes one more way of handling it. So important part to understand is this is a common way of handling exceptions in case of MVC. You write down your own attribute if you want. You may continue using handle error attribute if you want, and then handle the method called as OnException, and then you may implement that attribute on top of base class. Define a base class for your controller, and now there is no need to write down any attribute on any class. No attribute to be written on home controller. No attribute on any method like index method, because index doesn't handle it, home doesn't handle it, base handles it all over. And how base handles it? Because handle error is on the base, and whatever exception types you wish to handle, you just go and put it over here itself. Is there any other way of handling exceptions? There is. So I'm going to add one extra controller now into the program. Let me call this home controller as test controller, and we have again index method available here. Now inside this index method that we guys have, what I'm going to do is I'm going to again throw an exception along with some exception message that we may have some error. Now one more way that we have, if you don't wish to handle the exception at each of the method level, in that case any exception occurs in a method, ultimately it occurs in a controller. So controller base offers us a method. If you go to base controller, go to definition, base controller comes up with a method which is called as, let me show you the method. It's a method which is called as OnException again, if you can see here. So we have this method which is called as OnException now, and which is virtual again, which means if you don't wish to handle error way, in that case you may go on override here itself OnException method, and again you get a parameter called as filter context, which is ultimately exception context. And now again I'm going to put a breakpoint here, and now instead of any you can say base code calling, we may do log in db, and then we may return a redirect to the view which is called as, let's say, error view. So we wish to go to some error view now. I would say redirect to a view which is called as error view. So let me specify the view now. Let's close this, and I wish to go to, I should have specified some sort of method here, action result, return a view which is called as error view, and redirect to, I'll specify now, slash test slash show error. Let's see what happens now again. So we'll break into the code first. Now there is, okay, F5. So sorry, default page called is home controller. So I should have given call to test slash index. So I'll go to app start, go to root config, and specify the default controller to be called is test, and the default method we wish to call is index. Run now. So here we break in the code. Let's say F5. We come to OnException method. We can do the db log, and then we'll redirect to the, you can say, page which is show error page. Now again the problem that we have, guys, that custom error mode is not set. Is it? Let's check. We have set up custom error mode. Yes. Let me try this. Break in the code and F5. So still not working. Maybe, I guess I made a mistake. Shouldn't have been full path. Still no. So I've removed the code, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify to MVC that the MVC exception is right now already handled, and I would like to tell MVC engine that with respect to this error, let's set up a view which is a new view where we want to go to. Let's specify new view result, and let's convey which view it was. So it was a view called, so the name of the view was error view 01. So I'll specify error view 01 to go to here. You may pass on any kind of, you can say, view data also if you wish to as a parameter. So let's run the code again. We'll land upon test slash index, code breaks, it goes to controllers method, and then we will redirect ourselves to the error view also. Now, and you can pass on as usual the view data view back, which is, you can say, very common way of passing data to the exception UI. Now what will happen again if at all we want it for every controller? So we have option. Let's remove it from here, from this code, and then let's create a base class for it. So let's construct a base controller and then write down entire code into it. But make sure you inherit from controller base class now, just like we did it for handle error some time back. And then inherit from so-called base controller for your application. And that's it. Now you need not write down any exception handling specifically at a class level. No exception handling to be done at a method level. At a base controller level, you already have it done. So already contains a base controller class. Okay, so I'll just write down maybe h base controller class. And here also I'll specify h base controller class. Now I'll run this. So again code breaks. If I say F5, now we get same exception one more time. So this is, you can say, in both the cases, whether we handle the error using handle error attribute or custom handle error attribute, maybe moving the code for exception handling to the base is always a good idea. Second option, you may not even write down handle error attribute. You may simply go and override the method called as OnException in the controller class itself. And that's it. Everywhere it is applied in that case. So after this, is there any other way of handling exception? So there is one more way of handling exception. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to again create a new controller. Let's call this controller as maybe app controller. And again, we are going to go and throw the error from here. So I'll say throw new exception and some details. Maybe let's say anything or no details at all. Nothing, doesn't matter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a call to app controller first. So again, from app start under root, I'm going to make a change in the first controller class, that would be app class. And then I'll be running it. So for this page, obviously, there's no base controller, there is no h base controller, there is no handle error anywhere, and the code breaks, and we have a stack of error in the UI itself. Now, how do I handle? If you don't wish to handle at a MVC level, then there is a default way available in case of ASP.NET. That is, at this file, if you have heard of global.asax, we by default have application start, where the, you can say, root registry or root format is already mentioned. So I'm going to write down one more method here, which you must have seen in ASP.NET, a protected void application underscore error, which normally in ASP.NET by default exists. And then I'm going to put a breakpoint over here. So let's run the code again. And this time we'll be running app controller. So let me say F5 here. Default call will be given to now index method from app. And then if you see, we end up into application error again. If I say F5, obviously we haven't handled it gracefully. So if you see, this is one way of handling the exception, but this is not a good way of handling exception, because this is more of a what we call it as ASP.NET's way of handling exception, and this is not the way how MVC handles the exception. And using application underscore error, it means we have moved out of MVC, and that way there is no way to get application data like view data, view back. We won't be able to get it here. Reason behind that, application error is ASP.NET's way of handling exception at a common location. But anyway, it exists. In worst case, if you want to handle at a common level, you may go for application error. But then keep in mind that you may be moved out of, or rather you are moved out of MVC, so it would be a problem. So that's the way, or these are the ways of handling exceptions in MVC. So that's it. I'm going to end the session now.